Today I'm speaking with Dr. Chloe Carmichael. And Chloe, I'm really interested in your backstory. You were telling me that you wanted to talk a little bit about mental health relating to freedom of speech, as well as some of your own experiences in graduate school. And so if you could just go into your bio a little bit and say a little bit about yourself and how you got to be in this particular conversation.
Absolutely. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm super interested in the mental health benefits of free speech. So I wrote an article about that for the New York Post, called something like, "As a clinical psychologist, I believe that freedom of speech is better for mental health than censorship." And I give three main reasons why, which I would love to share with you here as well. And part of the reason that I felt compelled to write that even in the first place is because I think that the field of psychology is so staunchly located and boundaried within these, very particular orthodox viewpoints that it's like we can't step outside of them. And I really think it's hard to get even research done that would challenge, any of the orthodoxy, because the professors at, I don't know the exact numbers, but I mean, if you were to look at the clinical psychology PhD programs and then, look at the political identification of the professors in those programs, I would imagine you'd literally find it to be about 90% liberal. And what's even worse to me, and I'm surprised that this isn't more of a thing amongst faculty, because since graduating, I've even had more courage to discuss this problem, like with some faculty. And they've been like very receptive to the conversation, but they've ultimately told me that they truly are unconcerned about this as being a problem. And it's so interesting to me that they have such a bias around this. But what I was saying is that the reason why I think it's such a problem is because it creates such an echo chamber. And, normally, as a researcher that what you want is people who are going to be thinking critically about, the constructs that you're positing and all that. But if you don't have that, and in fact, you have people who have a bias to bolster and, confirmation bias and all these things, it exponentially increases, this lean and this bias of this research to the point where, again, I'm shocked that we don't have more research talking about the importance of freedom of speech from psychologists, because psychologists of all people are normally the people that are, oh, put it out. It's just words. Just say it, speak it, whatever it is, get the words out on the table and we can analyze it and we can work through it. We can figure it out. But there's nothing that I see about that when it comes to, so much of speech today. And, as a graduate student, of course, I was so powerless, to challenge those narratives because it is so subjective, like who gets through these clinical psychology PhD programs, because so much of it is the professor's, own judgment about, you as a clinician and your readiness. And so obviously, if you say like that you disagree with them about X, Y, and Z, it's only going to sandbag you, potentially indefinitely. So I just remember really stifling myself. And I got into such a habit of that in graduate school. And then, being in New York City, which is obviously also there's a overlapping heterodoxy there, or not heterodoxy, orthodoxy of viewpoints. And then moreover, I was in the media, like where there's also this, extreme bias. And so it was almost like I didn't even realize it, but I got so used to just keeping things to myself. I never said anything actually post-graduate school, I should say. I never said anything that I thought was untrue during graduate school. I'd have to pretend I agreed with things I didn't. But after graduate school, when I was just, speaking to the media, I would never say anything I didn't think was true, but I would also avoid any topic that I knew speaking what I believed would, get me in their blacklist. So I just got so used to all that that it was like a second nature that I didn't even realize how much it was affecting my own thought process. And when I moved to the free state of Florida, during the pandemic, which is a whole other issue of, groupthink about, the masks and all this
Mhm.
stuff. And I was like, no, can I swear here? I don't know if I can, but I was like, no freaking way are you doing that to my 3-year-old? And so when I finally got here and then it was my first time kind of coming out of the closet. I wrote an article about why I felt that masking children was harmful and got very interesting feedback from colleagues when I shared it with them before I published it, where I said, hey, am I missing something here? Because I feel like this is really obvious, but no psychologists are talking about this. And they said, yeah, everything in your article is true and correct. We don't disagree with you on anything you're saying, but you shouldn't share the article because it could discourage people from masking their kids. And I
Wow.
felt like I was in the twilight zone. So anyway, I shared the article and then it was like something shifted inside of me being here in Florida where I could speak my mind and taking that original step of sharing that article. I noticed my own thought process became deeper. And so that was what stimulated me to start thinking about the mental health benefits of free speech. And so here we are.
Wow. I'm really interested in hearing your breakdown about the mental health benefits of free speech, but that's really what an experience of finding yourself self-censoring and kind of closing off. And I spoke with an Australian academic recently who talked about how we are very good as people at picking up on the taboos of our context, whether they're explicit or implicit. We just know what the sort of no-go zones are for us. And we as naturally social creatures, we conform to those limits. And it's fascinating also as a psychology student that you're coming up against the hypocrisy of being in a field where we're supposed to really be open to exploring human behavior, human thought and experience. And yet here you are asking some questions about some things, and you're finding that they're rushing to either pathologize or close off an area of discussion. That must have been, and I know for myself, when I was a psychology graduate student in an applied psychology program for counseling, that was so jarring to me because it was such a conflict with other areas of our inquiry and our study.
Yeah. And I would even add, not only to understand which areas are, as you said, taboo and, which ones we shouldn't talk about, but also to recognize what are their biases that I can also play into.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, as a, powerless would-be graduate student applying to these programs, which I don't know the current statistics, but I know at one point it was harder to get into clinical psychology PhD program, at least an APA accredited one, than it was to get into a medical school.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, especially frankly, if you're white, because there's, such a, it's not even it's some kind of a suspicion I have. It's something that the programs will say with pride that they reserve X number of spots, often with free tuition, if you are what they like to call a person of color.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you happen to be white, it's even more difficult, I think, than to get into these programs. But so I not only knew which things I couldn't say, but I also knew which narratives they were
Mm-hmm.
going to particularly love. So, for example,
Mm-hmm.
I was raised in an evangelical Christian family, and I knew for sure that if I wrote in my essay and talked in my interview about how that was so limiting and blah, 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 even though, frankly, I didn't even think it was true. I
Mm-hmm.
just knew that they were going to eat that up, and they
Mm-hmm.
did.
Mm-hmm.
They loved it. And it's so interesting to me that they have so much bias that they can't even see it. And these are the people who are supposedly like the kings and queens of rising above your bias. It's almost comical. except that it's actually hurting people. I think it's hurting the
Mhm.
public that, we have these, such extremely skewed, distorted clinicians coming out of these programs that are then, viewing through the lens of all of this,
Mhm.
I just say like a regular blue collar guy that they then want to be like, oh, well, he's toxically masculine, or,
Mhm.
just a woman who wants to be a homemaker, or, and
Mhm.
I understand there's varying degrees of this bias, not like every single clinician is this way, but I having sat in on so many classes and conversations and supervisions, I see this bias. And I know I'm not even the only one, which is why I'm so thankful like for your podcast and for places like the Open Therapy Institute, where we can at least talk about the problem. Again, and I'm not saying it's every single one of them, obviously,
Mhm.
but it's a big enough problem that I think it's worth talking about.
Yeah, I agree. And that unacknowledged bias that's so huge. It represents this massive blind spot, and that's really fascinating. It'll be interesting to see how that gets discussed in times to come as these sorts of things unfold, and the pushback against that narrative becomes more mainstream. It'll be really interesting to see how we dissect what has happened here with this political bias in academia and in these psychology and education programs. Why do you think that, as you said, around 90% of the faculty that in the programs that you're describing are progressive politically? Why do you think that that is the case? How did we get to
I
that point?
Yeah, I think it's a self-perpetuating problem, because, when you have, I don't know, whatever the critical mass tipping point is, but at a certain point, these faculties become almost hostile for,
Mm.
say somebody like me to join. And I mean, I even discussed this, like I said, very openly with somebody, with a faculty member from my program that I was very close to and had a good relationship with. I was, I graduated in as soon as you could graduate from my program. I was, by all, I'm just saying I just don't want to think I have like sour grapes or something. Like I graduated from Columbia with a 4.0, and then I went into a top program and finished in the fastest time that you could finish. And, I think I had magna cum laude from that program. So I had good relationships, with faculty, but it was based upon me masking, who I actually was in many ways. And so when I got out of the program and had my degree and no longer felt, beholden, this is to answer your question, Leslie, about, why is it that these,
Mhm.
programs get this way? And I sort of came out of the closet, at a get together with one of my former professors. And I shared with him, my concerns. And it was so interesting because I said kind of exactly what you're saying. I was like, don't you think that there's a problem with the fact that there are not, say libertarian, independent, conservative perspectives in the faculty? Because he acknowledged that this was true. He just didn't think it was a problem. And I said, well, do you really think that somebody, say, with my perspectives could join the faculty at my school, at our school? And his response was so interesting. And I know exactly what it was because this was part of our conversation after getting together in person that we continued over text. So this was literally what he wrote, is he said, no, to be honest, to be frank, no, I don't think that, somebody, with those perspectives would be welcome, but I don't think that that's a problem. They could just join a different, faculty. And I texted back, I was like, but don't you think that the fact that there are almost no faculties where, such perspectives could be welcomed is, again, part of the issue here? And, he wrote back in a friendly way, but he was just like, I just don't think we're going to have a meeting of the minds on this one, but no, I just don't think it's a problem.
Wow.
And I was just like, again, it is so interesting to me because this person actually specializes in stereotypes and bias. That's like
Wow.
one of his main areas of research.
Wow. Well, they can just go set up their own island.
I
It's kind
guess,
of the
yeah.
attitude. It's like, go, there's another place. It's not here, but that's okay. They should create their own space.
Well, I mean, as opposed to even understanding though that if there is essentially currently one island, that island would be richer with diversity
Hmm.
of, viewpoints.
Yeah.
I'm so surprised that this is such a, hurdle to jump for these people.
Yeah, it is really fascinating. It's really fascinating. And that you describe your being able to reveal your own thoughts about the biases that you were exposed to in the program, and your own sort of stifling of thought and expression during the program. You describe it as coming out of the closet. And so it must have been really significant for you to finally be able to say what you really thought about some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, it was huge. And I mean, I used to joke that kind of felt like I was in the federal witness protection program. I mean, I remember as an not, well, so not so much as an undergraduate, but as a graduate student, when you're around the professors a little bit more and you have more collegial relationships with them, I remember all the time laughing at jokes that I didn't think were funny because they would, it was not unusual at all for them to make jokes
Mhm.
about, people who saw politics differently or, again, evangelicals or, frankly, white people, or, you can use the word rednecks, but you can't use other words that would refer to certain groups of people. And, I just had to kind of smile and nod and, grin and bear it. And yeah, I mean, it is like coming out of the closet. I mean, obviously, it would be so much easier to be in, frankly, it's probably a point in your favor if you're applying to graduate school and you're whatever the current word is, gay, queer, LGBTQIA2S plus, like whatever the current lingo is, you don't have to come out of the closet for that anymore. Like that's honestly, I feel like more of a point in your favor as an
Mhm.
applicant, but you would have to closet yourself. I know this from personal experience.
Mhm.
If you are, anything but, as you said, just kind of like a progressive leftist, and again, it's not even being a liberal. It's not even just being a classical liberal. I would frankly qualify as a classical liberal.
Mhm.
But there's just this, kind of the echo chamber intensifies these viewpoints
Mhm.
further and further and further to the point where there's just no reality testing for these people after a certain point.
Mhm. Yeah, and those cl so-called closeted identities are more like a badge that you would wear on your sleeve at this point.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it is really it's striking how we absorb, I guess I'm kind of going back to that, but how we absorb the knowledge of what the narratives we're supposed to speak are. And I had been out of academia for a long time when I went back to graduate school. I finished my undergrad in 2008. I started law school in 2009, and I left law school in 2010. So I left midway through my program. And then I took a long break where I was just working and I was raising kids. And I went back to graduate school in 2019. So I'd had this big break from academia. And when I got there and they were talking in this particular way, we were hearing these kind of phrases, this stuff about white fragility, the stuff um, about gender and just the pronouns, for instance, the pronouns.
Oh,
That was not a thing I'd ever been exposed to in any professional or educational setting until I got to that university. And yet I don't really have a strong sense of the first time I heard it. It's like I just kind of understood it. I don't know where that comes from. I've tried to puzzle this out before. Like when we did a group interview for my graduate program, and I was asked for name and pronouns, and I knew what that meant. And I don't know why I knew what that meant, because I hadn't, it's so interesting how things that are in the zeitgeist, we all sort of, we encounter them and we absorb them sort of passively, even if we're not formally educated into them. And yet I also knew that it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like this was a psychologically healthy thing to be doing. And I was really surprised that a applied psychology graduate program would be promoting this.
What year did you say that was?
That was 2019.
Oh boy. Yeah, you were definitely in the thick of it.
Yeah, yeah. When were you in school? When was your
Yeah,
graduate
so
program?
I will say that I went to school later in life. So I started graduate school in 2006 and finished in 2011.
Mhm.
Um, so, I again, like many, again, I don't even know if it's the same anymore, but I know when I was going, they really kind of valued the idea of like people that weren't necessarily like fresh out of
Mhm.
college or something.
Mhm.
I actually was fresh out of college, but that's because I went to college much later in life as well.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, me finishing by 2011, I was thankfully never exposed to any quote pronouns issues, but there were other things. So for example, I remember in my internship, um, which was, in the last year of training, like, I don't know if sometimes people think of an internship, if I don't know if most of your listeners are psychologists, but for anyone who doesn't know, when you're finishing a PhD, the very, very last final year of your training in which you actually finally even get paid, they call it an internship. So I was in that final year and, we were having this, discussion about an article. I can't even remember exactly why, but somehow it came up in the conversation that in Africa, um, there was a medication that was the United States was paying to make available to mothers in Africa so that they wouldn't pass HIV to their babies. Great. But then I think it was a course about a conversation about cultural competence or something, which again, cultural competence, really what they mean is indoctrination to the way that we want you to think about, you know, all these things.
Mhm.
And so it came up that the cultural issue was that these mothers, after having been, given this very, very, very expensive at the time medication so that they could be pregnant but not pass HIV on to their baby in utero, that after they gave birth, what they like to do for their culture is to breastfeed. And that oftentimes this would result in passing HIV to the baby
Mhm.
anyway, and
Mhm.
that there's no medication at the time to prevent that. And so I said, gee, I'm not sure that that's the best use of resources then. If
Mhm.
these mothers are telling us right up front, like, I'm going to be breastfeeding my baby because
Mhm.
that's what I do in my culture, and I expect you to honor that.
Mhm.
Okay, fine. We're not trying to stop you from breastfeeding your baby. But is it then the best use of our resources to be spending all this money to give them medication so that they don't pass HIV to the baby in utero?
Mhm.
I was just raising that as a question.
Mhm.
And I remember a woman, my intern colleague, looked right at me, and she obviously she was, hook, line, and sinker into this ideology. And she looked at me and she had fire in her eyes, and she said, "Careful, Chloe." And I remember it was my first time really encountering it in such a visceral way. It
Wow.
really felt like a punch in the gut. And I looked at her and I said, careful of what?
Right.
Like, what? Like, what? What do you mean, careful? Like, what? It,
Yeah.
it honestly felt like a threat. She goes, careful, Chloe. And I
It
was like,
sounds like a threat. You're just
careful
pointing
of
out a
what?
logical
Yeah, like
inconsistency.
we could even
Yeah.
have a spirited disagreement about it, and I could
Mhm.
even be wrong, and we could have a deep ethical, philosophical conversation. I'm up for that. I wasn't even vehemently saying we shouldn't be doing this. I was just raising the question. And she said, "Careful, Chloe." And I said, "Careful of what?"
Mhm.
And the professor intervened at that point and said, "Okay, let's move on to moving on or whatever." And it was just, to me, honestly, at the time, I actually felt like I was being given leeway, that the professor kind of allowed me to say that. But in retrospect, I feel like the appropriate thing to a professor for a professor to have done would be have said to her, like, "Hey, this is an intellectual environment. Chloe's raising a question. If you disagree with her premise or you want to, tear apart her argument, by all means, like respond in force. But what do you mean, again, like by telling her to be careful? Like, so
Hmm.
it's so ironic how at the time I felt like the professor was, quote, protecting me in some way.
Hmm.
But in retrospect, I'm like, he actually really should have set boundaries with that student that she felt, emboldened on that level to just essentially try to silence me from just asking a question.
Hmm. Yeah, to analyze that exchange, it sounds like she used a one word, which was a threat. It sounds very threatening. Careful. That implies like if you do something here, there's going to be a repercussion. So you're walking really close to a line. And you know it. I mean, she doesn't even have to explain what it is. She can just use the word careful in that tone of voice. And that indicates, oh, I should recorrect myself because I'm too close to going over a line. And somehow you knew that that was a line. You understood that there was a line there because you felt protected when he sort of softened the blow and allowed things to just move forward. So you actually had this gratitude to him because you were being nipped by this person who was trying to check you from going over a line. So when you go back and think about that, what do you think exactly the line you were crossing was?
Yeah, I think that, the line, I guess, I mean, I don't know, but I will say that this particular colleague of mine, um, she happened to be African American or Black or whatever people want to call it these days.
Mm-hmm.
And she was really into that as an identity for herself. She
Mm-hmm.
talked about that often. And so I don't know if the fact that we're talking about people in Africa and she felt on some level that it was not my right as a white person to have an
Mm-hmm.
opinion about the way that resources from the United States are being allocated there to ask that question. I'm not sure,
Mm-hmm.
again exactly. But I think that the idea was careful of your white privilege, even though that term wasn't even, I guess it was actually. We did use the term white privilege. I remember in my cultural competence, I laugh when I say that now because that's to me, it's like the opposite of like what that really is the way
Mm-hmm.
that they teach it. But in the cultural competency class, we learned about the knapsack of privilege,
Yeah.
the naps. And what's so funny is that at the time that was presented to us as if it was like an actual research fact that we should be learning about, as opposed to like, years after graduation, I came to understand that this was essentially just like a random essay written by a woman that it was founded on nothing. You know what I mean? And it was being given to us, and, for the most part, we were, intellectually or at least academically accomplished people that were there to learn and to be given, frankly, that drivel
Yeah.
and the trust that I had in those academic institutions at the time to just be like, yes, professor, let me read this article and highlight it and reflect on how it will affect the work that I do. Like I had almost a robotic acceptance, not entirely a robotic acceptance, because obviously I retain some amount of critical thinking, but I did have a great deal of respect for the professors and for the process. And I was more than willing to assume that if it's not sitting right with me, it's probably my fault and
Mm-hmm.
that I need to like, think harder and figure it out. That was my
Mm-hmm.
general stance.
It's almost like an emperor's new clothes scenario. You're more
Yeah.
willing to doubt your own judgment or your own perception. And that knapsack of privilege, I came across that for the first time after I was already embroiled in this process of criticizing the graduate program that I had, that I hadn't yet left, but I was, in the process of dealing with a grievance with them. And I was looking on in their social justice resources, and I came across this. And it is on the same level as a lot of the stuff that I was being taught in my multicultural perspectives, cultural competency course, which in hindsight, and even at the time, it felt very sophomoric. It felt very, very out of place. As you're describing, you're learning, presumably you're in a cohort of intellectually capable people who can encounter really complex material, and we're reading things of a much higher caliber. And then here's this thing about the addressing model or the privilege knapsack or white women are Becky's. And you're actually being taught this stuff right alongside the other coursework. It's quite jarring, really, that this is passing for graduate level material, because it feels like what I thought at the time is like, it feels like an 8th grade seminar. It feels like something really simplistic, and yet it would be diabolical to teach this content to 8th graders because it's so divisive and ugly, but out of place, as you say.
Well, good for you that you had the, wherewithal to spot it. To be honest, at the time, I just drank it up. I just, I was very eager to, learn. And I think part of the reason that many of us had actually attained such high academic credentials is because we had, just kind of an eager beaver, please the teacher, ready to learn type of attitude. And, I was pretty naive when I entered, this program. And so, like I said, I'm describing to you the way that I was in my 5th year. But I had the quote cultural competency in my 1st year. And so I had a kind of an open slate of a mind at that time. But cheers to you that you picked up on it right away.
Well, I don't know. I think it's interesting also that I guess speaks to something else. It's like, how do we find certain people can, I guess, resist this, and who goes along with it? What is it about us, our circumstances, that maybe makes our mind a little more open to skepticism? What makes us more likely to go along with it? And that
agreeableness.
I think that's a really, really good point. And I was speaking with a parent recently who was talking about her frustration that her daughter, who is young, we're talking about preteen, is trans identified. And the doctors and nurses in this kid's life, the mom is not affirming, but the teachers, doctors, nurses all affirm. So when she takes her kid in for medical checkups, they're saying, "Hello, young man." And they're
Can we
picking
say
up,
collude instead of affirm?
Yes, I think that's a better word. But she's expressing incredulity to me about how can these doctors, we're talking about medical professionals, when in life is it more important to get the basic biology correct? And when you've got the mother saying, call her she, and then the doctor still resists and goes along with what they see the kid wanting, and in violation of the parent's request, still goes along with this he. And she's saying, how can these medical people who are highly trained, highly educated, highly intelligent, and also have a duty to get the science right, the biology right, how can they be so sucked up into this ideology? And so we were talking about some of the characteristics that lead perhaps professionals to be maybe in some circumstances even more conformist. And so I wonder what your thoughts are on that. What are those qualities, and what is that process that might lead these people in these professional programs, these highly intelligent, highly capable people, to go along and, as you say, collude with something that's really delusional and nonsensical?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I wrote the article about mental health benefits for free speech for New York Post. I also wrote an article for Fox about groupthink. And I think that that's kind of what that is the underlying issue there, is an issue of groupthink. And so to write that article, I looked and learned a little bit more about the origins of groupthink and Irving Yanis, and how he coined the term. And in his original article about that, he talked about certain conditions that can set the stage for groupthink to occur. And one of them that he talked about was self-censorship occurring. And so obviously, again, when we have these incredible power dynamics, whether it's students against professors or, lay persons against so-called experts, there's just a tendency for self-censorship, or employees against, a powerful hospital, or, individual psychologists against the APA. I think that that can set the stage for groupthink. Another one of the conditions for groupthink that he talked about was a sense of moral superiority. So if, and obviously that they frame it this way, would you rather have a dead son or a living daughter, or, it's bigoted rednecks that don't understand that gender is different from sex. But then of course they do like the whole like word sleight of hand there, where all of a sudden sex actually really is what we're talking about. And you really can, not just be a man by sex, but a female by gender. Nope. Now we're actually, they do this whole sleight of hand. And there is this sense of moral superiority as well as intellectual superiority. And then of course we also, think about, I think it was Ash's experiments in social psychology with the lines. Remember, like where you have 8 people or whatever in a room and 7 of them are Confederates, and all 7 of them will say that line A is shorter than line B, even though we all can see it's not true. But then the 8th person, or however the experiment goes, just goes and buys in, right? And then we know from cognitive dissonance that when we start doing certain behaviors, we then begin to adapt our thoughts to accommodate those behaviors. So even if you said line A is shorter than line B, and you intellectually kind of knew it wasn't true, but you were doing it because of social pressure. Well, now you've done that behavior. You've started wearing the badge, using the pronouns, whatever, and then your cognitions will begin to distort. And we know that that cognitive dissonance research. There's media pressure as well, which I think and I talked about this in my Fox article too, which creates a false sense of social consensus. So, we not only have a professional pressure, but we have a social consensus, and it's all tied into this, moral superiority. All of these articles, by the way, are linked at drchloe.com. Or actually, I moved it. It's so funny. I got deranked on Google when I started putting all this stuff on my website. So I made a new website. It's called makeachange.us. And that's where I put all this stuff, is at makeachange.us. But I wanted to say just, one other thing too, because, again, about agreeableness, and certainly I'm agreeable, honestly, for the most part. Like I'm an independent thinker, but I like people. I even just by virtue of being a woman, which is interesting too, because these programs are so heavily skewed as women, and women are higher on agreeableness. So even though I'm generally an agreeable person, I do hear some anger in my voice when I talk about some of these topics, and the way that I kind of realized that I was railroaded and that the public has been hurt. And, I just want to say that the healthy function of anger, and I'm not saying this, Leslie, to educate you, I'm sure you know this, but it's just something I've been thinking about myself, is that the healthy function of anger is to set boundaries, and I do think that this is kind of anger arises appropriately when we sense an injustice. And how ironic, right? Again, because they claim social justice. It's that cloak of moral superiority that sets the stage for groupthink, when in fact it's the opposite of really what is just. And so I do recognize that it evokes some anger in me, but I'm trying to use that anger constructively, which is to speak truth to power, as they say. So that's what I'm doing here.
No, I really appreciate that breakdown. I think that's a very clear breakdown of some of the dynamics of groupthink, some of the things that are at play when we find ourselves in these groupthink experiences. And we've certainly had a number of them over the past couple of years that have played out on the world stage, really, in a way that we've, like with COVID, the masks that you talk about. This was incredible to watch happen. It was terrifying for a lot of people. A lot of people were terrified of the virus, but just as many people were terrified of what they saw as just delusional groupthink. We're all going to hold on to these masks as if they are some kind of a good omen that will protect us, even though we know they won't. Yeah. Will you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, so it's been a while since I've thought about that article, because thank goodness, like not too many people are doing that anymore. But yeah, I mean, so obviously, again, putting masks on young children when they're learning language and things, and we know that even as sophisticated adults, we will learn better if we have a visual to reinforce what's being said. And that visual is oftentimes the moving lips that will just help to reinforce, what is being said. So, of course, there were educational and learning losses. But another area that I still have yet to really see studied that I voiced some concern about in my article was actually the issue of self-esteem and emotional flattening. And I talked about it really for children, but I think it goes, for teens and adults as well. But that if it no longer is rewarding to make a facial expression because nobody can see it, will we be less prone to make facial expressions because they're no longer an effective, means of communication? Not that we consciously think, oh, I'm going to make a facial expression and it will get a response. But, obviously that's just part of our subconscious process of communication. But I was also especially worried for children and their self-esteem because they're building that basic sense of belonging and safety in their community, and they don't have verbal skills yet as much. So if they're just sitting there, playing with blocks and something's frustrating and they're frowning, and no adult comes over there and says, "Hey, Junior, what's the matter? You look frustrated, buddy. What's up? What's going on?" The child doesn't realize nobody's responding to me because I'm putting my outer lip out, but it's covered up by a mask. And they just literally feel unseen because they are. And so, yeah, I get very worked up about it because I was actually quite happy in New York. I lived there for 20 years. Well, I loved it. For all the complaints I'm sharing about it, I was actually pretty happy there and had a pretty good life there. But with my 3-year-old, then 3-year-old son, he had been home with my husband and me for, most of his life. We hadn't put him in daycare. And he was almost 4. And so it was that September that we were going to be putting him into, like a preschool type program. And the governor had announced that even at that age, he would literally be 3 years old, almost 4, starting for the first time out of the house all day away from me, that he was going to have a mask on his face. Nobody could see his face, and he couldn't see the face of anybody else. And it's like, no freaking way. Absolutely not. But at the same time, I didn't think it was good for him either, as he was, getting close to 4, to just be like in with my husband and me all day. And, even I would take him to playgrounds, and parents would want the kids to be 6 feet apart. And of course, like, I'm not going to step on that if that's how they feel. But their kids would come over to my son, and then their parents would run and snatch their kids away. And I was just like, what is this doing to my son? He's getting the idea. He's only 3 years old. Like, every time somebody comes up to him, people come and grab the kid and pull him away, like as if my son's a bad pit bull. So I remember, I'm really not a hysterical person, but I remember just going to my husband and just breaking down and like almost hyperventilating and just saying, I hate this. I hate this. I hate this. I just kept saying, I said, we have to get out of here. And so we went to Florida and didn't even know if we were going to stay forever. But like I said, it was just, I started to experience the mental health benefits of free speech, and we haven't left.
Well, I'm glad you were able to find a place that relieved you of some of those experiences where you weren't experiencing it. I guess I want to not lose my capacity to be shocked by that, because I think it's really shocking that people would treat a little kid that way. And the experience of rejection, that social harsh rejection from other people when you're just forming your social map, when you're just trying to learn what it is to communicate with other people and how to be a person in the world, a little kid having people snatch their other children or turn away from him in disgust and fear. What a thing to teach a kid. What a thing to have to experience.
I know. And those poor adults didn't know any better. I mean, I'm not really blaming them on a personal level because, they were, just part of the, I mean, you and I have at least a certain amount of clinical training and awareness, but for, your average person who doesn't even know or think or understand about, psychology or things like that in the way that we do, they were genuinely just trying to protect their children. They were just swept up in the misinformation, interestingly enough, as it all turned out to be. It was all, misinformation, and they were swept up in that. So I'm not angry at them personally, but I am angry at the system that allowed that to happen.
Well, it's really generous of you to give that kind of grace to the people who were perpetuating those things. And I wonder about that. I actually wonder about the level of responsibility that each person has. One of the things that I think this kind of harkens back to something else that you were saying earlier. I can't remember what it was, but maybe you'll remember what it was when I say this. There's this tendency when we do public messaging, when you have government or public health authorities messaging to people, to kind of talk to people like they're idiots and ask for something that's a bigger ask, because we underestimate the ability of people to really comprehend real information if we were to say what the truth of something is. And so that, for instance, the mask thing, it felt like it was this giant overextension. Like, if we just tell everybody to wear them, we don't need to explain to them that this actually doesn't pass the thing, but it's going to actually train them. It's just a training tool to remind them to be a little bit more cognizant of whatever. And it serves as an emblem to remind people that there's a dangerous virus. I mean, there was maybe I'm giving too much credit, but I think that there must have been some reason why they thought that this was important. And those are the sorts of things, when I kind of like try to reason my way back from it, what could they have really thought we were doing? Because clearly those in authority over health policy knew that these things weren't actually functioning the way that they were telling people. But if we tell people it protects you, then people will act. We don't have to really explain to these idiots that the real science behind this. We'll just tell them what we want them to do, and then see where they go. So there's this overextension, this talking down to people, because we don't expect the layperson to actually be able to understand.
Yeah, I mean, there is, as we were talking about, I guess the social consensus and, a sense of trust that people have, in the expert class. And I mean, I used the word misinformation earlier, but I think what you're hinting at is that to a certain possibility, there was also disinformation. Mm-hmm. So in case anyone's unclear, misinformation is when you give the wrong information by mistake. Mm-hmm. Disinformation is when you give the wrong information on purpose. I keep it straight by thinking misinformation, mistake, disinformation, it's a diss. Like they're doing it as disrespectful. And it's so funny because I actually looked that up myself about 15 years ago. I was just curious about the differences. And then it was interesting the way I never ever could have predicted, though. I thought it was just being a word nerd, like when I was looking this stuff up. But
Came
anyway.
in handy.
Yeah. But I mean, again, with the masks too, to your point, like who exactly knew what and when? I mean, we'll never know. But I think Fauci himself, even somewhat early on, acknowledged that he had first told people that they didn't need masks. And then he said that they did need masks, but he hadn't said so earlier because the healthcare workers needed them. And then, I mean, the story changed so often. And you're right, he was actually open about, to a certain degree, positioning himself as somebody who sometimes just had to dole out certain types of misinformation or disinformation because it was all for the good of everybody in his ultimate judgment, but and I think that's part of the problem too, as far as the lingering anger and distrust that the public has, because there was never an apology. You know what I mean? Like I would personally, and again, maybe I am actually rather agreeable and I'm actually high on suggestibility. I would probably be almost foolishly open if the government even came out and said like, hey, we apologize, like we mishandled that. And that was wrong and Fauci's going to jail or like whatever. Like I would probably be open, or even if Fauci, I wouldn't even need for him to go to jail if he were even to just himself come out and say, I got confused and I made the wrong choices or whatever. But there's just been no accountability. And I think in order for anyone to have trust again, we need to have that. And I'm shocked that it hasn't happened. But again, maybe that just shows how gullible I am, that I'm shocked that it hasn't happened.
Well, it's kind of amazing that we never see that. We never see any kind of accountability for those overreaching policies. I mean, going all the way back to, I would say, to 9/11 and the Iraq War and Bush's handling of that afterwards. We still haven't had a reckoning for things that it feels like we just sort of depend on the short attention span of the people as they go about their lives. So,
which is why we need free speech again, because a lot of these things, they fade away because, people don't talk about them. So I know we're coming towards the end of our time. Could I quickly run through the top 3 reasons why free speech is good for mental health?
I would love that. Yes, please.
Okay, awesome. So free speech, number 1. It promotes learning and growth. So evolutionary psychologists have, long speculated that part of the reason that humans evolved to such a successful and sophisticated species is because of our gift of language, that we can rapidly exchange information, right? And so we need free speech in order to do that. Also, when we verbalize, information and ideas, it puts it into a system that we can analyze, which actually helps us to not only develop good ideas, but to discard bad ideas. We've all had the experience of saying something aloud, and even as we say it, we say, you know what, that doesn't sound right. Maybe I don't actually think that, right? And then we can have an organic discarding of an idea rather than pantomiming that we don't believe that anymore because it's no longer in vogue to believe, whatever that is. Okay. So the second reason why free speech is good for mental health is because free speech helps safe spaces. So again, it's ironic because a lot of times, people want to squash free speech in the name of hate speech and bullying so that we can have safe spaces and inclusivity, right? Whereas honestly, I think the opposite is true. It's much safer for us to actually know how people really feel about us. Okay, so I'm a white woman. If somebody thinks negatively about me for any reason, because I'm a woman, because I'm white, because I'm a white woman, whatever, I would just much rather know about it. And so I actually feel much safer when we can tell the truth to each other. Also, when we get this idea that we have to squash speech in order to have safe spaces, we're going along with that idea that words are violence. And as a clinical psychologist, I'm telling you that is a psychotic idea. It's dangerous to have that idea. And for example, as a clinical psychologist, if somebody tells me that he's going to go shoot his neighbor with a gun, it is my legal duty to call the authorities to stop that act of violence. But if my client tells me in private session that he's going to go tell off his neighbor and call him names and be mean to him, it is illegal for me to call anybody and tell them about that. And the distinction is that one is words and one is action. Words are not violence. And I think it's making people feel unnecessarily anxious and hostile, because if they should say something that could offend someone and then they feel as if, they've committed violence, or somebody else says something that they don't like and then they feel as if violence has been committed against them. Again, this is actually undermining the sense of social safety that we should have. And then the third reason why free speech is good for mental health, I'm just looking down at my article here, I printed it out, is I personally believe that free speech can reduce anxiety and depression. Because again, as psychologists, again, to me, this is obvious that we know that verbalizing our internal life increases our sense of control. That is something, it's like psychotherapy 101. You go to therapy, you talk things through, you start to put your internal life into a system of language, and you begin to feel a sense of control about how you choose to feel and how you choose to see things, or maybe force yourself to see things as they are because you're speaking them out, and whatever it is. But a sense of control is essential to mental health, to the point where one of the hallmark features of depression is a sense of helplessness, not having control. And so putting things into words obviously helps to create a sense of control. The opposite would be repression, suppression, denial, things which are really not necessarily things we want to boost up in order to increase mental health. And then the last kind of subset of point 3 about how free speech can reduce anxiety and depression is that free speech, I believe, facilitates social support. And we know that social support is key to mental health, to the point where any basic psychosocial evaluation has to include an evaluation of, if somebody has relationships in their life, because we know that social support is really a protective factor for mental health. Now, if we cannot tell people the truth about who we are and how we feel, I believe that would degrade social support, and vice versa. If they're not telling us the truth and we're not having, close relationships that can withstand disagreement. So in a nutshell, Leslie, those are 3 reasons why free speech is good for mental health, and people can go to makeachange.us if they want to get a link to the full article.
Wow, I think that's really educational, and it's really clearly and eloquently put. So thank you so much for that description.
Thanks for the chance to share it, to speak it.
Yes, I'll put links down in the description under this conversation for anybody who wants to go and find more of your work. Do you have any other recommendations or links that you'd like to direct people to?
Yeah, the only other thing I would just say as well is, my book, Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety, is about the healthy function of anxiety, which is to stimulate preparation behaviors. I feel like there's, again, it's such a push in our society, ironically coming from the mental health field, to medicalize and monetize basic parts of the human experience, and people tend to think like, oh, I have anxiety, like as if it's like a disease necessarily. And again, ironically, people who don't know how to use anxiety in its healthy level, if they suppress it and repress it and think you have to just always try to relax and think of a beach whenever you have anxiety, they're blocking themselves from using anxiety in its healthy function, again, which is to stimulate preparation behaviors. And they are, I believe, ironically setting themselves up to have an anxiety disorder. So if people want to learn more about that, I write it as a very fun, easy to read book with lots of storytelling. And it was endorsed by Deepak Chopra. And it's Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety. And if you read it and you like it, I would love to have good reviews on Amazon, because that helps a lot.
Excellent. Well, I'll also provide a link for that. So if people are interested in going and checking that out, ordering your book, they can get that in the description.
Thank you so much, Leslie.
Chloe, it's been a real pleasure to speak with you. Thank you very much for this conversation.
The pleasure's mine. Thanks again.